Hello, my name is Logan, and for my personal project, I built an arcade machine using the RetroPie operating system for a Raspberry Pi. So my learning goals for this project were to work with a Raspberry Pi for the first time because I hadn't had any microcomputer experience before, and I thought it could come in handy. And I also wanted to learn some woodworking skills because I hadn't done very many woodworking projects in the past before, and again, that might come in handy in the future. So for my project plan, I felt like I stayed on track most of the time. I think I got a little behind after week 2 and 3, but it wasn't too much, and I thought I stayed pretty on track. So for week 1, my plan was to build the cabinet, and that was basically cutting the pieces and sanding them and all that stuff. For week 2, I was going to spray paint the cabinet, and for week 3, I was going to configure the operating system, make the Raspberry Pi work. And then for week 4, it's basically a miscellaneous week. I was gonna mount all the stuff in the machine and then finish anything I hadn't quite gotten done yet. So these are the resources for my project. The first one is a project homepage. Here, I'll show it to you. This is the video for the project. They have it on the homepage, and they have get digital plans here so you can download the plans for the project. And they also have a list of all the tools and materials you'll need for the project, which is pretty cool. So for my second resource, I had a video that showed me how to set up the RetroPie operating system, like configuring it, putting it on the SD card and all that. And my third one was adding a power button to the Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pis don't actually have a power button, and it was kind of a hassle to shut it down before I had one. So I figured it would be a good thing to add a power button, and this video showed me how to do that. And then my last one was testing the arcade controllers. I figured it was a good idea to know that they worked before I actually put them on my machine. So that video showed me the best way to do it. This is kind of pre-week 1. I had to collect all the materials. The main materials I used were 2 half sheets of plywood, a Raspberry Pi, the 2 USB arcade button kits, a light, a power strip, a cord extender, and spray paint. Your materials might differ depending on what you want to put in your machine. Like, you might not have a light, and you might use a different kind of spray paint than I did. But generally, this is what you're going to use for your arcade machine. So for building the cabinet, I had to cut the pieces, which I used several different kinds of saws for that. I used a jigsaw and a table saw mainly. I had never had any experience with either of them before, so it was pretty good getting to use them. The jigsaw was used for the awkward shaped pieces, like that was pretty much only the side pieces, but arcade machines have an awkward shape, so the jigsaw was pretty useful for that. And then the table saw was good for all the square pieces because it gives you a really straight edge, and that's pretty much the rest of it in the arcade machine. And then I had to sand all the pieces, and I learned some good sanding technique doing that. I learned that it's better to use a thicker grade when you're trying to get rid of all the excess wood that the saw has left on there. And then it's better to use a thinner grade sandpaper for making it smooth and nice to the touch. And then I had to assemble it. I got to use a nail gun and a drill press for the first time. I'd never had any experience with either of those either, so that was pretty good. And after I had assembled it, I had to fill all the holes in the arcade machine using wood putty. Since I used plywood, there are just naturally going to be holes in it. And then with the nails from the nail gun, there were a few accidental holes created. So the wood putty just made it nice and smooth. So week 2 was painting the cabinet, and I learned lots of good things about spray painting doing that. The technique I learned was using lots of thin coats is a lot better than using thick ones, because even though a few thick ones might be faster, it causes lots of drips, which means you have to sand in between it more. And then I also learned it's really good to sand in between each coat, because if you put on a spray paint coat, naturally it's just going to get rougher, so sanding it keeps it smooth. And I also learned it's really good to do long, smooth strokes from end to end so that you don't miss places in the coat, because that'll just force you to have to put more on. And I also learned it's really good not to forget to dust off each piece before applying the next coat. I did forget that a few times, and I had to sand it a little extra in between those sessions. So for week 3, I had to configure RetroPie. So I had to format the SD card to open RetroPie when I turned on the Raspberry Pi. For that, I used an SD card formatter to get the SD card prepared for the operating system. Then I had to use a disk imager to install the image onto the SD card so that the Raspberry Pi would run it. Then I had to build, wire, and configure the buttons. Building and wiring the buttons wasn't too hard. I already had the panel cut out from building week, so I just had to put the buttons in it. And then wiring, I had to connect the wires to the USB encoder and the buttons. And there are 11 inputs on these USB encoders I had, so I had a max of 11 buttons. I have 2 controllers in there, so each one only had around 6 to 8 buttons and a joystick to it. But if I wanted to, I could have had 11. And then configuring wasn't too bad. What I had to do was I had to tell the operating system what buttons I wanted each command to respond to. So for my arcade machine, I had it so that X is select and Y is back. So I had to configure each button to do what I wanted it to do. And then I also had to upload the games to RetroPie. What I did for that was in a little USB stick, I had to create a folder in it called RetroPie. And then I put it into the the Raspberry Pi USB port, and it would install all the files I needed into it. And then when I opened it up again, there was a folder that allowed me to put ROMs, which are the game files, into it. So I put the games into the ROM folder, and when I plugged it back into the Raspberry Pi, it would just automatically put them where it needed to go in the SD card, which is pretty nice. And then that was the same week I also built and programmed the power button. The power button was a unique experience because since it wasn't directly connected to the USB encoders, I had to plug it onto the pins in the Raspberry Pi, and I actually had to create a code that would tell it to, when the button is pressed, run a command that would shut down the Raspberry Pi. And week 4 was just miscellaneous, as I said. I had to put the vinyl prints on my arcade machine, which gave it a nice retro flair. And I also had to install the marquee and the light for the marquee so that it would light up. And I had to build and install the back panel. So, for my reflection on this project, I definitely learned a lot of patience. I felt like I was trying to jump into it too quickly without thinking it through before I started the project, and it was really important that I did think it through. My parents had to remind me to make sure I did, because it could have turned out a whole lot worse if I had just jumped right into it, and I learned that real quick. And I also learned it's okay for me to take my time. Like, I tried to do too much at once, and I tried to force something to happen faster. That, like with thick coats on the spray painting, it just made it drip. So faster isn't always good. And I also learned that problem solving was important because, like, I had to work with differences in the resources I had for my arcade machine. So, like, the light, for example, he used a different LED light for his marquee, so I had to work around the differences there, but it turned out all right. And I also had to work with holes in the information because for me, he didn't tell me how to do the back panel, but I wanted a back panel on my arcade machine, so I had to think through the best way to do that. So if I were to do this again, I would definitely try to be more patient and pay more attention to details. Yes, I missed a few holes while doing the wood putty, and a few other things could have gone better as far as details go. And my most successful moment in my project was when I got the first game to run properly, because that's when I really realized that this was possible and it was happening.